History is filled with questions that continue to puzzle experts for centuries. But among them, one mystery surrounding a remote patch of land in Utah's Uinta Basin stands out above the rest. Scientists have monitored it. The Pentagon has funded research into it. And in 2020, a physicist with decades of experience in United States missile defense and NASA research, Dr. Travis Taylor, came face to face with something on this land that he still cannot fully explain. What really happened at Skinwalker Ranch, and why does this story continue to fascinate researchers, skeptics, and audiences alike? Before we go further, it's worth being clear about what this film is and what it isn't. This is a documentary about a real place, real owners, and a real ongoing television investigation. Much of what you're about to hear, the land sales, the government funding, the on-camera claims made by named investigators, is documented in interviews, public records, and news reporting. But many of the events described at the ranch are personal, anecdotal accounts that have never been independently verified by outside scientists. We'll make it clear throughout which is which. This is the story of a 512-acre cattle ranch in rural Utah that became the subject of a secret government program, a best-selling book, and one of the most watched documentary series in cable television history. And it's the story of the man who walked onto that land as a skeptic and, by his own account, left it changed. To understand why this land matters, we have to start with geography. The ranch sits near the small town of Ballard in the Uinta Basin, close to the boundary of the Uinta and Ouray Reservation, home of the Ute Indian tribe. Reports of strange lights and unusual aerial activity in this broader region date back decades, long before any single property became famous. But the ranch's modern legend really begins with one family, the Shermans. In the early 1990s, Terry Sherman and his family purchased the property, and they later described a wave of bizarre occurrences. Cattle mutilations, unexplained lights in the sky, and encounters they said they could not explain through any conventional means. It's worth noting, as historians and skeptics point out, that the family who had owned this same land for 60 years before the Shermans arrived reported nothing unusual at all during their entire tenure. That contrast, 6 decades of quiet, followed by a sudden wave of strange reports coinciding almost exactly with new ownership, is still part of the debate today. And it's one of the central reasons skeptical researchers urge caution before accepting the ranch's reputation at face value. In 1996, the Shermans sold the property for around $200,000 to Robert Bigalow, a Las Vegas aerospace and real estate billionaire who had already founded the National Institute for Discovery Science, an organization built specifically to study unexplained phenomena using scientific method. It was Bigalow who gave the property the name it carries today, borrowed from a concept found in Navajo folklore describing a malevolent shapeshifter capable of transforming into animals. It's important to be precise here. That name was not given by the Navajo Nation itself, and it wasn't a name the ranch had carried for generations among local tribes. It was assigned by the ranch's new owner in the 1990s as part of building the property's modern mystique. Bigelow's team spent roughly a decade quietly monitoring the ranch, installing sensors, conducting night watches, and interviewing witnesses. They never made their full findings public, and to this day, much of what that early investigation actually recorded remains unknown outside a small circle of researchers. Let's lay out, in order, what we actually know, separating documented history from anecdote as we go. In 1996, Robert Bigalow buys the ranch and begins a private investigation through his institute. In 2005, journalist George Knapp and biochemist and researcher Colm Kelleher publish a book examining the ranch's history and the claims surrounding it, bringing its reputation to a national audience for the first time. That book compiles second-hand accounts from the Sherman family and Bigelow's early research team, and it became a genuine bestseller, cementing the ranch's place in American paranormal folklore. Around that same period, according to multiple journalistic accounts, a Defense Intelligence Agency official reportedly reads that book, becomes personally interested, and visits the ranch. He later relays his own account of the visit back to Bigalow. That chain of contacts, from a published book to a curious federal official to a personal visit, is reported to have helped lead toward a Pentagon-funded program that studied unidentified aerial phenomena more broadly, a program that later became publicly known through congressional disclosures and investigative reporting, including a widely cited 2021 piece in The New Yorker, examining how the U.S. government came to take UFO reports more seriously. Then, Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid is documented as having supported the appropriation of tens of millions of dollars in Defense Department funding connected to this research effort. Skinwalker Ranch, as Bigelow's property, is reported to have been one site of interest connected to that broader program, though the full scope of what the government actually studied or concluded about the ranch specifically remains only partially public. In 2016, Bigalow sells the ranch to Brandon Fugel, a Utah real estate developer and chairman of Colliers International's Utah operations. Fugel initially purchased the property through a shell company specifically to keep his identity as the new owner private, a detail he has since confirmed publicly. In 2020, the History Channel premieres a documentary series giving television cameras unprecedented access to a newly assembled team of investigators on the property, a team that includes physicist and aerospace engineer Dr. Travis Taylor. During that first season of filming, Taylor and other cast members report a series of incidents on camera, incidents we'll examine closely in a moment. And from 2022 into this year, the series continues across multiple seasons, expanding into a companion program and drawing continued, often pointed scrutiny from scientific skeptics and folklore historians along the way. Now, let's spend some time with the figures who anchor this story, because their backgrounds matter enormously to how seriously any of these claims should be weighed. Robert Bigalow is the aerospace entrepreneur whose private fortune funded the first serious, if largely secretive, investigation of the ranch. Bigalow made his wealth primarily through real estate and later founded Bigalow Aerospace, a company that worked on inflatable space habitat technology and partnered with NASA on related research. his personal and financial interest in unexplained aerial phenomena predates his ownership of the ranch by years, and it's that broader interest that drew him to the Sherman family's claims in the first place. Brandon Fugel is the current owner, a commercial real estate chairman in Utah who purchased the property in 2016. Fugel has said publicly that he has never personally profited from the investigation, and that he has instead reinvested proceeds from the television series into continued research and, at times, charitable causes. He's described the purchase as an unusual real estate transaction that became, in his own words, a genuine science project. Fugel has also spoken about his personal religious faith, framing his interest in the ranch's phenomena, partly through that lens, as a search for evidence about the nature of existence and whether humanity is alone in the universe. In 2022, Fugel announced a partnership with a museum institute in Lehi, Utah, aimed at better understanding the ranch's environment and historical significance, a step toward bringing outside academic partners into the investigation. Brian Arnold, known on the series by the nickname Dragon, and Thomas Winterton, the ranch's superintendent, are both cast members whose day-to-day accounts form much of the show's ongoing record of unexplained events, from strange sounds to physical effects reported after disturbing the ground on the property. And then there's Dr. Travis Taylor, the scientist this story centers on. To understand why his presence on that ranch carries weight, it helps to understand who he was before he ever set foot on the property. Travis Shane Taylor was born in July of 1968 in Decatur, Alabama. His father worked as a machinist at Weil Laboratories, a company that subcontracted with NASA in the 1960s, contributing to the launch of some of America's earliest satellites under Wernher von Braun's team in Huntsville. Growing up in the Huntsville area, surrounded by the culture of America's early space program, Taylor developed an early fascination with engineering and physics. As a teenager, he built a working radio telescope in his backyard, sensitive enough to detect radio emissions from supernova remnants, a project that won a statewide science competition. That achievement caught the attention of the United States Army, which offered him a cooperative education opportunity straight out of high school, funding his engineering studies at Auburn University while he worked at Redstone Arsenal on directed energy weapons research, part of the Strategic Defense Initiative program of the 1980s. From there, Taylor's academic and professional path becomes extraordinarily dense. He earned a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from Auburn University, then went on to the University of Alabama in Huntsville, where he ultimately collected a master's degree in physics, a doctorate in optical science and engineering, a master's degree in mechanical and aerospace engineering, and eventually a doctorate in aerospace systems engineering as well, along with a master's degree in astronomy. Over a career spanning more than 3 decades, Taylor worked across NASA and the United States Department of Defense, including a long tenure with the Army's Space and Missile Defense Command, where he held the rank of senior scientist in the Space Division. His documented research areas include advanced space propulsion concepts, large space telescopes, space-based directed energy and laser systems, and modeling work relevant to missile defense and hypersonic systems. Much of the specific detail of that work remains classified, a point Taylor himself has acknowledged publicly. Outside of his defense career, Taylor built an entirely separate public life as a science fiction author and television personality. He has written or co-written more than 20 published novels, largely through Baen Books, along with technical textbooks on rocket science and laser engineering. He first reached a wider television audience, hosting a National Geographic Channel series about homegrown engineering experiments with his family, and later appeared across a range of documentary programs examining space, technology, and unexplained phenomena. In 2019, Taylor took on perhaps the most consequential role of his public career, becoming chief scientist for the Unidentified Aerial Phenomena Task Force, a group formally assembled with backing from Congress, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and the Secretary of Defense, tasked with reviewing more than 140 documented military encounters with unexplained aerial objects in order to assess whether they represented any kind of security or safety threat. According to Taylor's own account, given in an interview with journalist George Knapp, his path onto that task force began independently of Skinwalker Ranch. Early in his time investigating the ranch around 2019, Taylor grew concerned that some of what the team was encountering might touch on national security matters. He requested a meeting with contacts at the Pentagon to share what he'd found, and it was through that meeting, after his security clearances were verified, that he was invited to join the newly forming task force as its chief scientist. Taylor has said he had to carefully manage separate non-disclosure agreements. One set connected to his work with Brandon Fugel and the History Channel at the ranch, and another connected to his government work, keeping the two responsibilities distinct even as they overlapped in subject matter. Taylor retired from full-time federal government service around 2022. After roughly 25 years split across NASA and Department of Defense programs, and subsequently joined a private defense contracting firm as a principal research scientist. That dual identity, credentialed defense scientist by day, on-camera paranormal investigator by night, has made Taylor one of the more debated figures in this entire story. His scientific credentials are not in dispute. They're extensively documented across encyclopedic sources, government records, and independent journalism. What is contested, and openly so, among some of his scientific peers, is whether that same credibility should extend to the specific claims made on Skinwalker Ranch. In 2022, the journal Science published a piece raising concerns about Taylor's simultaneous role leading a Pentagon task force while also starring in television programs, exploring speculative and supernatural topics. Seth Shostak, a senior astronomer with the SETI Institute, was quoted expressing skepticism that federal authorities would place someone with those television credits in such a prominent scientific role. Others who have worked alongside Taylor argue that his UAP analysis for the government relies specifically on hard sensor data, radar, infrared, and optical instrumentation, rather than on unverified anecdote, and that his television work and his classified work should be judged on separate merits. With that background in mind, here's what is documented on the record about what actually happened once Taylor joined the ranch investigation, kept carefully separate from anything that veers into paranormal interpretation. The ranch itself is a real 512-acre property with a fully traceable chain of ownership, from the Sherman family to Robert Bigalow to Brandon Fugel, confirmed through property records and consistent reporting across multiple news organizations. The Pentagon program studying unidentified aerial phenomena did genuinely exist and did receive congressional funding. A fact confirmed through Department of Defense disclosures, congressional records, and extensive investigative journalism, including reporting from The New Yorker. Dr. Travis Taylor is a real credentialed research scientist with a documented decades-long career in United States aerospace and defense research, confirmed independently through government biographies, the Encyclopedia of Alabama, and multiple journalistic profiles well before he ever appeared on television. Cast members, including Taylor, have described physical injuries sustained during filming on the ranch, among them unexplained burns, skin irritation, and, in the case of Superintendent Thomas Winterton, a reported lump on the scalp following excavation work. Taylor himself has described developing burns after opening what the show refers to as a porthole, burns his doctor reportedly compared to those seen in radiation exposure patients. These accounts have been reported consistently by the cast members themselves and covered in entertainment and mainstream press. But it bears repeating clearly, these have not been independently verified by outside medical or scientific authorities, and no peer-reviewed study has confirmed any paranormal or otherwise anomalous cause behind them. They remain personal testimony, offered in good faith by the people involved, not confirmed scientific findings. Skeptical researchers have been vocal in offering alternative explanations. Science writer Robert Schaffer has argued that the original claims of paranormal activity at the ranch emerged specifically around the time the Sherman family was preparing to sell the property. A timeline, he says, raises real difficult questions about where the phenomena actually originated and whether financial motive played any role in the earliest reports. Schaefer has also pointed to the fact, noted earlier, that the previous long-term owners of the land reported nothing unusual across 60 years of residence. Historian and folklore scholar Greg Agigian has separately observed that it's difficult to be anything but skeptical about the ranch's paranormal claims, given that those claims have largely been promoted by individuals who were already personally invested in supernatural explanations, without the ranch ever being subjected to sustained independent examination by outside academic researchers with no stake in the outcome. Let's walk through the major turning points in this story, because each one shifts what kind of story this actually is. The first turning point is the 1996 sale to Bigalow, the moment a working cattle ranch, previously unremarkable in the historical record for 6 decades, became a formal research site backed by a billionaire's private institute. The second is the 2005 publication of Hunt for the Skinwalker, the book by George Knapp and Colm Kelleher, which took the story from local rumor and a small circle of researchers to a genuine national bestseller. According to multiple journalistic accounts, that book is precisely what ultimately connected the ranch to a federal defense official, and from there, indirectly, to Pentagon funding for a much broader, unidentified aerial phenomena research effort. Without that book, several reporters covering this story have argued, it's unlikely the ranch would ever have entered the federal government's orbit at all. The third turning point, and the one this documentary centers on most closely, is 2020. The moment television cameras entered the property for the first time in its entire recorded history, and Dr. Travis Taylor, a credentialed government scientist with above top secret security clearance, stepped onto land that had, by then, accumulated more than 2 decades of testimony he had absolutely no way to personally verify going in. During that first season, Taylor and his fellow investigators documented what they described as anomalous energy readings using instrumentation Taylor brought specifically for the purpose of applying a more rigorous scientific framework to claims that had, until then, existed almost entirely as oral history and secondhand reporting. Taylor has spoken publicly, in interviews outside the show itself, about the psychological toll of the work, including describing nightmares he connects directly to his time spent investigating the property. He's also said on multiple occasions that he sustained skin burns while personally investigating a hole discovered on the ranch, burns that, according to his account, his own doctor compared to burns typically seen in radiation exposure cases. Once again, these are his own account and reported medical observations relayed through him, not independently confirmed findings about any paranormal cause. Taylor has been notably candid on this point himself. In his own words, relayed through interviews, he says he has no single working hypothesis that can currently be tested using accepted scientific method. Only a range of phenomena, energy readings, unexplained sounds, and physical effects that he says his team simply cannot yet explain using known science. He has described the process as similar to chipping away at a large stubborn block of stone, testing what can be tested, and setting aside what cannot, without pretending to have arrived at a final answer. This third turning point matters historically for another reason too. For the first time, claims that had circulated for 2 centuries as oral history, family testimony, and secondhand reporting were being tested on camera using scientific instruments, drone footage, spectrum analyzers, and formal data logging, even though critics have consistently argued that the testing methods used on the series fall well short of rigorous, peer-reviewed scientific practice. Critics have specifically noted, for example, that excavation work on the property tends not to go particularly deep and rarely involves the kind of careful, methodical archaeological process that would rule out mundane geological explanations, such as naturally occurring denser rock layers beneath the sandstone, before attributing unusual instrument readings to something extraordinary. Skinwalker Ranch's broader impact isn't measured in battles won or legislation passed. It's measured in something subtler, the way this single property has shaped public conversation around government transparency and unexplained aerial phenomena more broadly. The revelation that a real Pentagon program had studied unidentified aerial phenomena and that Skinwalker Ranch was connected in some fashion to that program became part of a much larger wave of formal government acknowledgement about these phenomena in the years that followed. A wave that has included congressional hearings, official Department of Defense reporting requirements, and extensive coverage across mainstream news outlets well beyond the world of paranormal enthusiasts. The ranch has also become something else entirely, a case study cited by believers and skeptics alike in how folklore borrowed from outside a culture, private wealth, and modern television media can combine to construct a modern legend almost from scratch. It's a case study historians of American folklore and UFO culture continue to reference specifically because so much of the paper trail, the land sales, the government funding, the credentialed scientists involved is genuinely real, even while the central paranormal claims remain entirely unresolved. So where does that leave the story, and what should we actually take away from it? Skinwalker Ranch sits at an uncomfortable intersection, the place where genuine, thoroughly documented government interest in unexplained aerial phenomena meets decades of unverified personal testimony, folklore borrowed from a culture that never named the land itself, and a modern television format built specifically to keep audiences in suspense across multiple seasons. That intersection doesn't make the story worthless, and it doesn't make everyone involved a fraud or a fool. It makes the ranch a genuinely instructive lesson in how mysteries survive across generations, not necessarily because the strangest individual claims are true, but because a real government program, a real chain of land sales, and real on-camera reactions from credentialed scientists like Travis Taylor together create just enough verified fact to keep the door open while the loudest and most extraordinary claims remain, by every honest account, unresolved. What we can say with real confidence, without overstating anything, is this: something happened, whatever it ultimately turns out to be, to convince billionaire aerospace entrepreneur to spend the better part of a decade quietly investigating this specific piece of land. Something happened through a chain of a published book, a curious federal official, and a sympathetic Senate Majority Leader to help convince the United States government to fund a classified study of aerial phenomena connected to it. And something happened to Travis Taylor personally on that ranch, significant enough that a man with above top secret clearance, decades of hard scientific credentials, and no obvious reason to embarrass himself in front of a national television audience, still speaks about it candidly in his own words, years later. What that something actually is remains, by every honest and rigorous account available to us, genuinely unresolved. Skinwalker Ranch will likely never deliver the single clean answer that would fully satisfy either true believers or committed skeptics. And this documentary makes no claim to have found one either. What it offers instead is something rarer, and arguably more interesting in the long history of the unexplained and unusually well-documented paper trail. A traceable, verifiable chain of ownership stretching from a quiet ranching family to a billionaire investigator to a real estate developer turned executive producer. A documented act of federal funding, debated openly in Congress and covered by serious journalism. And a working, credentialed scientist with a career built entirely outside the paranormal world, willing to put his own name, his own reputation, and his own instruments to the test in full view of the camera, without ever claiming to have found a definitive answer. Whatever ultimately explains the lights, the burns, and the unexplained readings recorded on that particular stretch of Utah rangeland. One thing about this story is certain. Travis Taylor walked onto Skinwalker Ranch looking for evidence, not legend, bringing the same rigorous instincts he'd spent 35 years applying to classified defense and space research. And the search he began there, honestly documented, openly contested, and still, as of today, entirely unfinished, continues.